Hi, I'm J.C. Hallman. This is the Anarcha Archive. Today, we're going to back up and look at when Anarcha first met the man who would experiment on her, the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
For many years, all that anyone knew about Anarcha was what Sims himself said and wrote about her and the two other young women, Lucy and Betsy, who were the named subjects of his earliest experiments. Anarcha was the first woman Sims saw, and before she presented with obstetric fistula, he performed a forceps delivery of her first baby, which, as we discussed in our last video, was probably stillborn. Betsy was enslaved by a man named Dr. Harris, and she was brought to Sims about a month after he first saw Anarcha. She, too, had a fistula. A month after that, Sims saw Lucy, who was enslaved by a man named Tom Zimmerman from Macon County, Alabama, where Sims had lived for a time, a few years earlier. Initially, Sims sent all three women away, only to call them back after he had a kind of revelation about how he might cure fistula. Of course, his real goals were professional and self-serving. He wanted glory and financial reward. He was proposing to cure enslaved women so they could return to their plantations to work, to be bred, or to be used sexually. That was the life of enslaved women. The question I want to ask now is whether this was the first time that Sims had met Anarcha. Before answering that question, let me say two things about Sims as a writer. First, he was prolific. Second, he was pretty good with words. By that, I don't mean he was a beautiful author. Rather, what I mean is that he knew how to twist words to his advantage. In article after article, he was devious and duplicitous. He would say one thing at one moment and another at another moment, and he was so slippery, you might not even notice it. In other words, Sims was a good propagandist. And that's remarkable, particularly in light of his autobiography, because compared to his other work, the autobiography is a terrible book. That might be because he dictated it, and it was never finished. His secretary for the autobiography, or amanuensis, was a man named Hiram Oatman, and as we said in an earlier video, the H in Anarcha's name appears to be Oatman's addition. It is not spelled that way in any other source. And here's something strange. The description of Sims performing a forceps delivery of Anarcha's first baby is not the first time someone named Anarcha appears in his autobiography. As I said, the autobiography is a bad book. It's just a terrible read. So the many people who have written about Sims and Anarcha can be forgiven for having skipped over some of the earlier portions of the book, which are quite tedious. That makes it easy to miss something important. Anarcha first appears much earlier in the book. A young girl named Anarcha cares for Sims during a bout of malaria that he suffers in 1836. It's not long after he arrives in Alabama, and he describes Anarcha tending to him, sitting up with him at night, while others died in the rooms around them. Now, Sims doesn't explicitly state that this Anarcha is the same Anarcha that would later play such an important role in his career. But he doesn't deny it either. Anarcha was not a common name, and an Anarcha who is described as a young girl in 1836 could easily be a 17-year-old young woman 9 years later in 1845. What tipped the scales about this, for me, was something Sims wrote years later, when his experiments were underway. He was writing to a man who had recently been cared for by Anarcha. I'll detail all this in a later video, but in writing Anarcha, our Anarcha, as Sims does here, he was saying that he, too, knew what it was like to be cared for by Anarcha. This is the only time her name appears in Sims' own handwriting. In other words, Anarcha, even as a young girl, had been trained and had worked as a nurse. And that's going to fit with a lot of the rest of her story. Long before Sims performed a forceps delivery of her baby, Anarcha nursed him back to health. She took care of him at a time when he wondered whether he might die. Today's video is a small piece of the much larger puzzle of Anarcha's life. It would seem that Anarcha first met Sims not as a 17-year-old girl, but when she was much younger, when she was already learning to be a nurse. and this fact will echo through the rest of her life. Next time, we'll begin to take a look at some of the more troublesome and controversial aspects of Sims' experiments.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.